First of all, I'd like to also add my word of thanks to Moshe, the Stiftung, and the BTC for enabling us to come together at least once a year to talk about these issues. I think it's human nature that people like to believe that they're not alone, working, as we might say in Israel, in their Dalet Amot, that we're not all working in our little windowless offices, but that between, obviously, Beersheba and Herzliya, but also between Brno, the Czech Republic. Where's Amal? I don't see my friend Amal. She'll be here later. We also have more things in common than things that divide ourselves. Now, like I think everybody else in the room, I'm an accidental higher education administrator. When I was growing up, my friends wanted to be a fireman, a policeman, a nurse, a New York Yankee pitcher. Nobody, including myself, stood up, I want to be working for a university when I get older. We just all happen to have found ourselves working for universities at some point. And similar to one other profession that we do choose, parenthood, we don't go to school to learn how to do it. Today there are a few programs at the MA level in America and in Europe where you could learn how to be better at working for universities, but traditionally we don't learn how to manage academia. But what do? We learn by example. Whether we like to think about it or not, or agree with it or not, we tend to raise our children similar to the way our parents raised us. We may not want to agree with that. We may not want to think, because we're very critical of our parents when we grow up, but at the end of the day, we tend to raise our children similarly to the way that we were raised. And I have found that it's quite similar in higher education, that when I joined Bar Ilan back in '93, how did I get into learning? How did I benefit from others? By looking to examples. So at Bar Ilan, the late Joe Lichtenstein brought me into the job, and I learned from him. But there are 3 other people from whom I've learned a lot since 1993. At least one of them is in the room, and that's Moshe. And since we go back from '93, and if Moshe mentioned 1996, together with Felix here, the 3 of us journeyed to Brussels, Leuven, Ghent, and Luxembourg to learn how to deal with the Framework Program 5. And that's as long back as we go. And all of us travel. We've had a long journey together since 1995, 1996, as far as the European Union is concerned. Just by the definition of the slide, to dive into what we're discussing, by definition, we are discussing team-driven, partnership-based projects. And this is something that may be a little bit difficult for we Israelis, and I consider myself an Israeli, even though I was born in America. We tend to think that we know it all and we can do it all by ourselves. Now, the nature of research and the nature of projects, we have to find a better definition, because research are also projects. But the non-research projects increasingly are international, multidisciplinary in scope. So we have to learn how to be able to work together. Moshe will not be happy with me in this presentation for one. What's on the slides are more important for me to help me not forget what I want to say. Moshe will perhaps not be too pleased with my remarks over the next 15 or so minutes, because when we were beginning to discuss this several months ago, we thought that it was clear that there were distinct management styles between the R&D projects, what we've come to know, and the non-R&D projects. And I'm less convinced that there are differences at the management level. I'm thoroughly convinced that there are even dramatic differences between the different types of funding mechanisms, and between the nature of the partnerships. But at the management level, and I think my slides will show that, I am less convinced. Now, since we're in Israel, I'm a nice Jewish boy, or so I like to think. We all know that, or we should know, that there are 2 basic forms of Jewish law. We have the written law, and we have the oral law, and the oral law is only slightly less important than the written law, and that's the way it's come over the past 2,000 years. Now, if we're talking about European projects, what's the written law? It's this entire EU legalese, the documents that are never ending, which are virtually impossible to decipher. But nonetheless, these are the documents by which we all have to work. What's the oral law? When talking about a European project, what's the oral law? Who is the oral law? It's the project officer. It's the desk officer. It's the person entrusted by the legal authority to interpret what's very difficult to interpret. And there's a third component in order to successfully navigate the project, and that's us, bringing our common sense and our experience. But there are, to follow this parallel, how do we treat the project officer in order to understand how to manage the project? And here again, I think that we have to treat the project officer as I, as a Jewish person, would treat a rabbi, and how to, or, give me a second. And how do I mean that? If anybody has ever asked a rabbi a question in order to get a directive on how to behave, you have to know that there are 5 or 6 things. And I don't want to miss them, so I'm going to read them from the paper. You have to know what to ask, who to ask, how to ask, when to ask, and most importantly, why ask. And the same thing is true with the project officer. You don't want to be asking the project officer, the desk officer, whether it's in Brussels, hi Joel, another one of my mentors, or whether it's the desk officer in Bethesda, Maryland, working for the NIH, or whether it's the person sitting a few blocks away up the street at the Israel Science Foundation. The people there that are entrusted with interpreting the laws, the directives, the regulations of the foundation are the most important people that you have to go to bed with for the 3 or 4, 5-year duration of the project. That wasn't supposed to be funny. I don't want to alienate Moshe too much from me, so I will nonetheless try to speak of a few of the differences between R&D projects and non-R&D projects. Now, the nature here is also changing because we do live in a dynamic environment, but traditionally at least, R&D projects were, if not solo-driven, they were duo-driven. We know, for instance, for the Israel Science Foundation, you'll virtually never find a proposal submitted with more than 2 scientists, usually from the same institution, but they can be from different institutions, always from Israel. If you go to the Israeli binational science foundations, again, traditionally, you'll have 2 people working together by necessity, an American and an Israeli, a German and an Israeli. That's for the basic science, for the fundamental science. And if you go into the industrial science, again, you'll rarely find more than 2, maybe 3 partners. The nature of that is changing. Certainly since 1996 in the framework program, we do have larger projects, but that's not necessarily the norm. The other thing about R&D projects is, and this I firmly believe, they are driven by scientific excellence, by academic excellence. That's the most important criteria for judging a proposal at the end of the day, or it should be the most important criteria. And thirdly, traditionally, R&D projects are, for the most part, either medium or long-term in nature, not necessarily addressing an immediate concern of society. This is in stark contrast to what we've come to know, in Israel at least, with the non-R&D projects, specifically Tempus, and also Erasmus, and ENPI, and other types of frameworks. These are, at best, policy-driven, at worst, politics-driven. The 2 are not the same, and what we've come to see that they're politics-driven more than policy-driven. And this creates, for us, a lot of question marks. There's less transparency. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Again, these are team-based for the most parts, and by team, we're no longer talking about solo or duo, but we're talking about multi-stakeholder projects. And multi-stakeholder projects do carry with them their own mechanisms in order to prevent chaos from ensuing. So there are differences as far as the nature of the projects, but again, I'm not necessarily clear that there are differences with the projects. So a few words about partnerships. And I'm being fast, and I'm not putting too much into my presentation because I do want, as Moshe said, to have some sort of discussion because I might be entirely wrong. So a few words about partnership, in 3 words in particular: balance, trust, and respect. Without these 3 ingredients, you can't have a successful partnership. And one of the differences between going back to the R&D projects and the non-R&D projects, clearly in a non-R&D project, which are multi-stakeholder, you do have to have a clearly identified leader, someone who will take charge, who will prevent chaos, who will, as we'll see later by a whole list of characteristics that I put up on the screen, will make sure that the project runs successfully. But another difference between, and you don't necessarily have a leader, therefore, in a solo or in a duo project. Another difference, I think, and this is stark, and I've alluded to it already, is the issue of trust. When you're working by yourself, hopefully you're going to trust yourself to do a good job. Hopefully you're trusting yourself that what you set out as an objective to do is something that you actually are doing. When you have many stakeholders at play, that's not clear or necessarily clear at the outset, but it has to be. Now, the issue of trust doesn't only apply to within the consortium. I think that's a given. This is common sense, and you'll see the word common sense will appear a few more times in my remarks. What may not be so clear is that the trust has to also be there between the project participants and the funding agency. And if you don't have that trust, you have problems. In Israel, if we look to an example, there is an extreme high regard in the academic community for the Israel Science Foundation and for the 2 binational science foundations that I mentioned earlier. Why is there a tremendous amount of trust between us? Because there's good transparency, there are good systems in place, and we believe in the peer review process. This same trust, I'm happy there are some European colleagues here, and I hope you'll challenge me on this maybe later on. My experience with the non-R&D projects, and especially the Europeans, because that's why we're here today, that I'm not saying we don't trust the EU systems, and there's no one system. Again, there are a lot of different systems in Europe, each with their own set of guidelines, laws, and regulations, but there's less transparency. And if we go back to what I said earlier about the projects or the programs being policy or politics driven, I don't even think they try to hide that fact. And so clearly there are differences between those 2. So we spoke a little bit about partnerships, and we mentioned the leader, and we have to talk about, for one moment, the people who are leading the funded projects at the end of the day. And there's a tension built in. There's a tension built in between the need for having a leader and the need for working together as a team. My president, Professor Reichman, when he speaks quite often to visiting delegations, he likes to tell a joke that there's a mother and a son enjoying a morning coffee together. And the son is complaining to his mother, "Mom, I don't want to go to school today. I just don't want to go to school today." And the mother is turning to, "I'm sorry, you have to go to school today. But Mom, I really don't want to go to school today. The teachers don't like me. The students don't like me. I don't want to go to school today." The mother goes to the son, "Well, I'm sorry, son, but you have to go to school today. First of all, you're 60 years old. Second of all, you're the president of the university." So it's even funny okay. So we're not university presidents sitting here in the room, but at one time or another, we're either leading a project, or we're working for or working with a leader. And leaders, as we know, don't make too many friends, but we do hope that they do instill in us trust, and that we can effectively work together. I think I am missing a slide. So I'll just, one last slide, which I had up here. Again, I want to bring this back home to the fact that most of our non-R&D projects are based around the Bologna process. and key in the Bologna process is the need for a lifelong learning. So I think that the exercise here today speaks well to that, as does the nature of the projects that we want to be involved with. We need humility. Again, as I said a little bit earlier, we can't go into projects thinking that we know everything. We have to build upon the knowledge base and the experience of people who have done it beforehand, whether they're our Israeli neighbors or whether they're our European colleagues or whether they're other third country partners. We need to build on the strengths and the experiences of others. So what I did was, I'm sorry that it's not on the slide, but there are 11 things that I came up with, and I'm sure each of us can come up with different ones or disagree with me on some of them. 11 ingredients for successful multi-stakeholder projects. And again, don't hit me, I'm not sure that this goes to management per se or more to the nature of the content world with which we're living. One, as I've said, you need to have a head on your shoulder when you go into these projects, and you have to be able to think creatively, going back to the oral law as opposed to the written law. There is movement for flexibility. You can't be rigid when you go into European projects. You have to think flexibly. You do have to be well organized, of course. We're all sick and tired of hearing about the milestones and the deliverables and the work package and all of this. But nonetheless, this is what we're committed to be doing. And in order to do that successfully, in order to navigate your 2, 3, or 4-year plan, you have to be organized and you have to communicate well. Again, this is not just for the person taking on the leadership role within the consortium, within the project. You have to be able to, the Rabim, the many, we have to be able to communicate effectively among ourselves, and this will come easily to we being mostly Jewish people here, we have to ask questions. We can't be shy of asking questions, and through those questions, whether they're to our peers, or whether they're to our colleagues abroad, or whether they're to the desk officer in Brussels, we need to ask questions. Number 7, never assume. We should never assume something, even if it's common sense, even if we think that that's what they meant there in the European Parliament. No, they probably didn't mean that. Let's go to our desk officer, or let's go to Mr. Corinthian, because we just don't know. Again, something that we're very good at in Israel. We're good at fixing problems. We're good at fixing problems outside of our four amot again. But since we didn't build the system, we shouldn't be arrogant enough to want to fix the system either. And what do I mean by that? One of our very successful student exchange programs is to Singapore Management University, where we send 10 students every year or more. And in the first couple of years of sending our students to Singapore, we didn't have too much of a problem, because for the most part, it was our international students that were going to Singapore, and the international students know how to operate in multinational or multicultural environments. But when the student exchange program started to take root within the Israeli community, all of a sudden we started to have a problem in Singapore, in that some of the students didn't pay close attention that when they registered for course back in August, the course would meet on Shabbat, on Saturday, or the examination was on Yom Kippur, it's a problem, but you should have known about it back then. The problem is when the Israeli student goes into the office of the incoming student exchange officer and gets an answer, doesn't like it, then goes to the director of the international relations office, and then proceeds to find the rector, assuming that the rector is going to be wanting to see this little Israeli kid from IDC, which is not the case. That may work at IDC, that may work at the Israeli institutions, but Singapore, for those of you who know Singapore, is not like Jerusalem or Herzliya. And the point of student exchange is to learn from them about another culture. It's not to bring your Israeli culture and enforce it upon the foreign university. So getting back to my final 2 points, the rules rule. You have to know the rules, read them again and again and again, especially if you're the leader or even the leader of one of the work packages, so that you won't have any surprises down the road. The last thing, and I happen to think it's the most important thing, which is why I like coming back to these events once or twice a year. You have to have fun. If these projects are not going to be enjoyable, it's not worth it at the end of the day. How many of us here in this room work 7 or 8 hour days? Don't raise your hand. I can imagine that I could count it on no hands. None of us work 8 hour days in higher education. Whether we think of it as a calling or whether it's just the fact of who we are and where we're working for, we definitely spend far more waking hours with our coworkers than we do with our wives and children. And we do that, and a few of us spoke about this earlier over, pardon? Husbands or husband. Okay, I can't, no. We have to enjoy where we're working and with whom we're working. Otherwise, it's a big question mark, why do that, given the investment of time and energy that we put into our work. So to close, I'm not thoroughly convinced that at the managerial level, there are differences between R&D projects and non-R&D projects, but certainly at the level of R&D projects and non-R&D projects, there are fundamental differences between how they're organized and ultimately how we navigate ourselves through them. Thanks so much.